person. Nona again. Shruti again. Ivana. Shruti a third time.
So should we proceed the way we've been doing it, or okay? So since this is the concluding class, let me kind of bring you, just by way of first about 5 minutes, into the various ways of bringing us up to Sod, what I was doing, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I had in mind about this particular section, and in the process, either interwoven with that or separately, I'll want to kind of make a couple of appreciative comments and of similarities and differences between what you read from Art's material. So, as you've seen, the structure of the book in progress is to try to follow the sequence of Pardes, but not necessarily as a chronological sequence. It's a experiential, phenomenological sequence that bends back over each other. But the 4 levels of interpretation I've tried, and we'll have to probably do more, but to try to link those with 4 corresponding levels of human and religious experience. So as you'll recall, which I believe to be fundamental for Jewish theology. So the first level, in terms of the Pshat, was to open us up to the experience of the self in the world. The self that we share with all humanity, responding to the world, smelling the world, feeling the world, and using some very basic texts within the Torah, reading them in a pshat way, a straightforward contextual way, to kind of begin the process of this awakening of awareness, awakening of consciousness, responding to things, being able to discern events that are happening, or as you saw with some cases with Abraham, when multiple things are happening, to make decisions in terms of that. The second level of the drash, phenomenologically, is focusing on the self in community, not simply the self who is out there in the world that shares a common humanity with everyone, but of course we're articulating that in Jewish terms, in terms of Pshat, but members of a community and members of a community of interpretation. So that already embeds the self in a history of culture, a history of interpretation, a history of worship, a history of language, and trying to find one's place within that larger complex of midrash, midrash Agadah, midrash halacha, and again, as I'll come back to, the same ways I was focusing on the issue of voice and speech as addressed in Pshat, now it comes through the larger metaphor of kol, and all of the midrashim that I gave at the very beginning of the midrash section, in terms of the voice that commands, that addresses, and that then is both reformulated by Moshe and then all the disciples of Moshe, including us, as we take up that call to make it a living form of religious worship. The issue of remez was of the self in terms of spiritual growth. So we're trying to reinterpret the larger tradition of remez, not simply as philosophical or ethical or ideals coming from values in the Middle Ages, but in a certain sense, turning to our own psychological, spiritual, much broader context of what we mean by self-growth in a very broad sense, and trying to kind of work through stages of awareness. And I tried to use the levels of the Sheish Zechirot, or I did actually the Sheva Zechirot, in terms of reflecting on historical memory and trying to use those as examples of madrigot, or steps of consciousness for the development of the self. And then I correlated that over against, it integrates Pshat and Drash in a certain sense, because it's personal growth, but personal growth it's using the language of the community. So it's not simply being out there as Pshat may be, and it's not simply being part of a collective, but recognizing that we all have to find our own ta'amei hamitzvot, our own way in this, in a very personal way, but also insofar as it's a Jewish theology, it has to use Jewish language or bring external language and retranslate it into specific Jewish terms. And the third, and this final level is the self really in the cosmos, the self that's trying to find its relation to itself and the larger mystery of the universe, and what we can identify as individuality or loss of self in terms of this much larger mystery of the whole. So overall, it's focusing on 4 levels of 4 types of consciousness. None of them are presented historically or any particular way. I very much wanted to do this, both because I believe that for the modern person, or at least for myself, I live all 4 levels simultaneously, or I live all 4 levels, and in different times of my life, different levels come into juxtaposition or into conflict, and they set up different kinds of tensions. My particular way in all of this to kind of deal with the, or to try to find a point of resistance against over subjectivity, and that everything comes only from the self, is that you'll have noticed a kind of leitmotif that goes all the way through, where the address is coming from outside. In other words, there is, and each type has a kind of external imperative that initiates the process, whether it's the external world, or understood as voice, or as call, or as another person, but that the self is also responding to types of imperatives. So it's trying to build in the primacy of our encounter with nature at one level, through text at another level, through a whole variety of worldly interpretive forms, the way they speak to us, the way they address us. And they become, as it were, primary addresses of the divine voice. And then we have to determine, in a certain sense, what is aseh and what is lo taseh. And of course, we build on this huge tradition, but I've tried to kind of build in aseh and lo taseh right into the very primary experience within nature, and then within text, within the self. And so one of the phrases that I had used very much at the beginning, I think one of the early interludes, was this tension between limit and longing, this kind of a tension between what can be done, what one has to hold back for, what one reaches out for. And this aseh and lo taseh is a ongoing tension in all 4 levels of how far you can go, where you have to pull back, what's the notion of restraint, where love and desire tries to keep pushing, and that dialectic and tension is all the way through. Now,
can I interrupt
yeah,
a second?
yes, please.
Let me just throw out an obvious challenge, which is not so much mine, but I know a reviewer of the book somewhere is going to say this. But these 4 levels, traditionally, were 4 levels of reading the text. The text was at the center. For you, the text has been replaced by the self. These are really 4 levels of the self. and they are deeper levels of consciousness, but the text, the Torah, is no longer the primary object. Really, the self has become the primary object, and what we are investigating is the deepening of the self, to which the text becomes somehow ancillary. I'm just throwing that out because I can hear the review.
All right, then I have to kind of, let me anticipate that response. I think you'll notice, firstly, that's why I emphasize that the self doesn't always initiate. The self is responding, right? So the self is responding to things at all of these levels. And that's a primary aspect of experience. The other, and I deal with it differently at each of the four levels, but the other aspect is that at each of those levels, I introduce the texts of tradition and I interpret them in four different ways. So we are selves, but we're also thickly embedded in that whole history of text and interpretation. And that's precisely why the type of language and description that's used, if you've paid attention or if you noticed, my style changes at all four levels depending on how I'm trying to describe what it means to exist either as a self or within the community. The text that I chose, and I think we'll come back to this later about this, the freedom to choose within this vast range of interpretation. Of course, both of us are trying to be very responsible to what is authentic to the range of tradition, but within that, it's not just an abstract cherry picking, it's an attempt to kind of create a vision. And that vision is very much articulating who each of us are. In Art's paper about his personal theology, he's giving you the texts that are most important for him, but as a self as well. And that those texts become the prism of self-exploration. That's really one of the new thrusts of our particular age.
Would you say it's always that way, everybody is that way, or would you say that's something different about our age that makes it that way?
I think our particular age, when we came to consciousness around issues of integrity, authenticity, self-awareness. These were the dominant metaphors of the 60s. And I don't think either of us have lost that, but there's also the issue of community. There's an issue of trying to be part of a historical past. But that for us in particular, it's not simply losing the self. The self that's being lost is a very particular critical awareness of the self. That's why I think I said in the conclusion, at least I was speaking for myself, that for the seeker, it's not that the self wants more self. The self wants the self in a very particular, heightened fashion that will reflect a particular, authentic stance. Obviously, we've come through the whole psychological, Freud was part of our experience in a different way than it is for this generation. The issue of the unconscious, the issue of stuff that hangs on that you have to become aware of. The Jungian material was much more powerful for us in those days. And then the issue of struggling between all of those competing Western thought, Eastern thought. It was very fresh in a different way, and we were trying to find out, or speaking for us in different ways, who we are in relationship to that, and whether you give it all up and you become something else, or you try to hold on to Judaism as a way of bringing these together as self in community in different kinds of balances. And I think over the course of our lives, these balances keep changing, even not only in aging, but even in the intense part of the old Chavurah days. That was a tension of, well, for some of us in different ways. So I do think that it is particular to our particular age. I think that both of us, and speaking also for myself, I feel a great responsibility to show that the multiple levels of interpretation can become multiple vectors to open up these experiences and to give them authentic grounding, but they're always interpreted in very personal ways. And each person will hopefully get the license to be able to find those texts, but then to create a kind of integrated form of particular worship. So for me, and then I think one of the things that overwhelmed me at a certain point when I came to realize it is that, and this is part of the response to what you're saying, and maybe it was one of the reasons I began to turn more towards an observant tradition, is the full realization that the self does not initiate selfhood, that it's given in lots of different kinds of ways. And the issue of the conversation begins with the awareness that something is addressing us, speaking to us, making a claim upon us, or our bodies. We have to become aware of that, or the other person, or the world, and that imperative, which is this multiplicity of the way the divine voice speaks, then has to be shaped and honed, and our tradition has given us various ways in which that has been narrowed down, and the oral tradition is opening it up in multiple ways. So this issue that there is ase and lotase that's deeply embedded, and that we have to begin making responses, but we are not we're not born new, we're not a homo novus, there's like nothing had preceded us. We have this responsibility to our own past and to the history of Judaism and to the history of Jewish sources. So that is part of the answer to that. Let me just finish off, and then maybe I have you come back to this. I also, you saw that the structure for the sod was probably a little bit different than you expected. It's a little bit more Lurianic in a sense. There is the pshat in the sod, the drash in the sod, the remez in sod, and the sod in sod. And I did that particularly because I wanted to make it clear two things. That there are these deeper mystical dimensions of awareness that come to consciousness at each of those four levels. And that it's not as if you're making a hierarchy and then you get to sod and then everything falls away, or it's an independent experience. It is that too when you're dealing about the sod of sod. So when I was focusing on the pshat of sod or the drash of sod, I was trying to give a variety of examples of how you could hold a type of sod consciousness that I tried to kind of articulate in the context of pshat. That deeper dimension that relativizes or that puts it in a different perspective, or in relationship to drash, or in relationship to remez. And then of course with sod, it's that was when it began to move out between dualism, non-dualism, the self, non-self, the issue of knowledge and sayability, non-sayability, knowing and not knowing, because that becomes the problematic that one would want to think about when one is trying to be honest about that level, not just as having the experience, but trying to integrate those powerful sod moments into the issue of these other four levels. So that's so in the case of, just very briefly, in the case of the pshat of sod, it was a question of how do you keep, I talked about multiplicity, the mystery of the manifold. So how do you keep the manifold in consciousness in the context of the specifics of everything happening? And I talked about that in terms of experience and in terms of language. In terms of the drash of sod, it was to try to awaken the multiple vectors of what seeking means, all the different forms of what lidrosh would be, as to keep that always alive as the deeper quest, even within the framework of midrash, which is much more specific, but it's without the deeper framework, the specific acts of drash lose their anchoring in the mystery. And I tried to do that with Remes, and then which was the manifold of oneself, to try to deal with that and to try to integrate the multiplicity that we experience of ourselves. What contemporary psychology talks about the parts, perhaps, but I don't mean it just in that way. And then for the Sod of Sod, I wanted to kind of bring things full circle to the mystery of speech and how language is this mystery that creates our reality, but then it dissolves, and to reawaken that wondrous notion of what we say actually affects of how we think and we see, and to put that in this context of this larger notion of Sod, of selfhood, non-selfhood. And the text that I particularly chose were texts that would work for me and would perhaps hopefully give you a kind of stimulus. Let me end with two things that perhaps might segue into also the way Art may want to continue this or to respond, is I didn't feel, or it's totally idiosyncratic, but in rereading the section from Radical Judaism, it's clear how important it is to legitimate this new moment of panentheism as a legitimate path within the contemporary spiritual quest. And in all the beautiful formulations, it's moving towards that vector because to show that we can be comfortable and confident, and we're not betraying anything, and we're actually bringing something to a certain type of fulfillment. And when I was reading that, it helped me clarify to myself that at least what I was trying to do was not necessarily to less give a kind of historical way to bring us to the present moment, but to talk about four simultaneous levels that a person could live now. And I wasn't justifying one over the other. Obviously, you can see that it's all moving, and the last part, by having dimensions of Sod in everything, for me that's the deeper undercurrent of everything. But for better or for worse, I didn't put it in a historical context. The other issue that I think that probably we have to come back to at some point before we conclude is the different levels of authority that we are trying to work with. The authority of personal experience, the authority of texts, the authority of the divine presence, and the authority of ideas that are out there that are making a claim upon us, and how we're trying to find a standpoint of negotiation. I don't feel that I have to apologize that these texts have an authority, life has an authority, people have an authority, but I'm always in a dialogical response to them. That response is crucial to this view, and I think in my own way, I don't think I articulated as strongly as I may need to at a later point, but the different modalities of authority at each of those levels are fundamental to what it means, I think, to be this kind of a religious person who's not just floating off in an experiential state, but those higher levels of awareness then have to be channeled back into very specific personal or cultural or forms of avoda. So let me conclude with one final thing. I think I used at the very beginning this notion that I spoke about theology as a form of prayer, and so it's a form of spiritual avoda. And I think that this issue of avoda as a type of work, it's a work, theology is an attempt to clarify to ourselves where we're standing in an authentic way, how it gives deeper meaning to our practices in a specific way. And this issue of doing, for me, is fundamental. Judaism, I don't think, can easily survive without an avodah shebalev, this kind of internal, but also the avodat ha'evarim. You have to do things with your body, and it carries it through. Even, and I would just point out, in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, when the first breakthrough of Kabbalah, of the Hanhagot of Kabbalah were integrated, even in the Beit Yosef, they were integrated into halachic statements of the Shulchan Aruch. In other words, now we maybe live in a different time, but it's indicative that the ideas don't float off only on their own, but there is an attempt to try to anchor them in what an avoda of practice is. Now, you are all struggling to find that, but for me, I'm still trying to find that. But the avoda of the Evarim and the avoda of Lev have to be brought into a relationship, and each of us are going to find that in a different way. But that's a classic Jewish way of finding that tension. It's not just ideas out there or study out there only, but it's how it becomes a practice. So let me conclude with a little vignette. I don't think Art has heard this, but it's a Heschel story that I first encountered when I moved to Chicago. Maybe if you've heard it, you'll recognize. So it was, so I met this person. They weren't kind of people that I remembered from many people from the 60s that I could encounter when I first got to Chicago, but this was a kind of person. He was a very interesting person. He was actually a hidden child. He was born in Holland, and he was hidden with Christians during the war, and he had lots of problems, let's put it that way, of his identity, not only his spiritual identity, but his moral identity, his self-identity. He was very, very complicated, but he's an interesting person, very interesting person, but he was always speaking to multiple levels of pain, and he still is, but at that time, he was professor of philosophy at Lake Forest College, which is a little bit north of where I used to live, and so he's a serious person. So then he told me the story when I first came. He said he was still very much struggling with his Judaism, and he somehow discovered Heschel, one of Heschel's books. So he invited Rabbi Heschel to come to Lake Forest College, and he picked him up at the airport. And they began by just trying to find out, who's who, and to develop a language of conversation. And he described, and so this person described a little bit of his life and his struggle with Judaism. And then Heschel said to him, it's echt Hasidish, he says, "So, Mr. So-and-so, what do you do?" And he said, "Well, I teach philosophy at Lake Forest College." And then Heschel said, "No, what do you do?" And he said, "Well, I teach ethics, and I teach film, and I do this, and I do that." And he said, "No, what do you do as a Jewish practice?" And that dialogue was so, I still remember it, because it also caught him totally off. What do you do? Because you have to do something to be Jewish. Even in his struggle, you have to do something. And that turned him around in a certain way. I didn't change him. He's still a complicated person. But that vignette, the way a certain kind of a Rebbe's way of thinking to ask a certain question, but it goes to the heart of the Jewish theology. It's not just the ideas that I'm struggling with. What do you do if you're going to make the commitment? And how are you going to do that? So for me, this these levels of avoda, and we have to all figure out, because we all have different backgrounds, we all have different life tasks. We're at a different end point in our lives than you're at a beginning point, and we're still working with that. But I would want to leave you with that little episode, because for me it's a core statement of once you make the choice, you have to do something, and then you can figure out how it's going to work, what texts are going to work, how you're going to integrate it, how it's going to play off in your prayer life, and how you're going to help your congregants as well. Like, what are you going to do? How are you going to do this to instantiate this, to make it work, to make it part of a Jewish avoda? Anyway, let's stop with that.
I don't have too much I want to say today because I want to leave lots of room for you to ask questions and for you to initiate. I see in your comments lots of things you would like to hear us talk about that we haven't talked about, or what about this and what about that. So I think there should be room for some wide open questions and conversation.
Did you feel that I answered your pushback? You have a lot at stake in that question.
You answered it. It's asked of me all the time, both by others and by myself, and I can hear the reviewer of either of our books raising that question. You know, is there too much self here? Is this not the sickness of modernity, that all we're left with is the self? That the tradition and its authority are really gone? And that the collective of Am Yisrael is really gone for us Americans as opposed to Israelis, and we begin and end with the self. I hear that critique loud and clear. Who I am is who I am, and I really can't avoid that, and I think that's true of both of us. But since it's out there in the back of my mind, I want to toss it to you. So I don't think we have an absolute answer to it. I think that as a modern, and we are moderns, even though we're trying to be postmoderns, we are also moderns. I do have to begin the process of this hermeneutic journey that you call us to, which I've been moved by ever since I read that article of yours about it 50 years ago in the Glotzer Festschrift, I think it was. The first version of this thing, which throughout Fishbane's lifetime has been developing. I have to add the seeker first. Maybe that's the same thing as the self. But I call it the seeker, which is to say, nothing is a given. The tradition isn't a given for me. Because I'm a modern and because its authority is broken, and because I came to it essentially from the outside, even though I started that journey when I was very young, I still came to it